Hi everyone, I'm Lynn Sures. Thanks to IAPMA for this opportunity to talk with you about working with paper and pulp in a time of change. The 5 panelists are part of the Pulparazzi, which I'll tell you a little about now to get started. In 2010, Beck Whitehead and I organized a small pulp painting symposium in San Antonio, Texas. We invited other pulp painters we both admired, and everyone presented work and demonstrated our techniques to all the others. The 11 participants were geographically located throughout the United States, from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific, from the Canadian border to the Mexican. The participants, as you see on your screen now, were John Babcock, Lawrence Barker, Shannon Brock, Joan Hall, Lois James, Anne McEwen, Michelle Samour, Preston Sampson, Peter Sowiski, Beck Whitehead, and myself, Lynn Sures. The exhilarating pulp painting symposium in San Antonio, as it turns out, had a great reach. We learned from each other, we all bonded, and the experience cemented us in friendship and artistic trust. Some of us formed the collective Pulparazzi. This group of pulp painters has continued for the past decade to hold events which bring us back together and allow us to continue exchanging our ideas and approaches to the work we do in papermaking. At universities and in galleries, we have held large demonstrations, participated together in exhibitions of our work, and presented lectures and panels every few years in different places in the United States, such as St. Louis, Missouri, Cleveland, Ohio, and Jamestown, Rhode Island. This year, sadly, we lost our treasured colleague and friend, Beck Whitehead, after her long struggle against illness. On a happy note, we send a warm salute to you from 2 Pulparazzi, not with us on the panel today, Shannon Brock and Anne McEwen. Our panel will share the ways in which we have each found sanctuary in our studios during the past year and counting, during the time of great uncertainty and upheaval in the world and in our own country. First, you will hear from Michelle Samour.
Thank you, Lynn. The studio became a sanctuary for me during COVID. The first work that I did during the isolation of COVID was a set of circular sheets of paper like the ones that I've been making for several years now as part of the series entitled Wired Eyes. I found comfort in beginning with work that was familiar, so I produced 28 sheets of 24-inch paper in 7 different prismatic colors. Each sheet is made from finely beaten abaca, which I poured into a mold, pressed, and then painted with pigmented abaca by brushing the pigmented fiber through a stenciled dot pattern. This is an example of one of these pieces. The circle functions as a symbol of the all-knowing eye, the eye of the telescope and microscope, and the physiological eye, our first lens to the visual world. After making these sheets and in preparation for later painting on them, I started on a new paper project. I wanted to make a piece that had many similar components and that would give me structure during this time of uncertainty. The resulting piece, which I will show you in a minute, which is called Milk and Honey Stuck, is now part of the series Borders and Boundaries, which I've been working on for several years. To put the work in context, I'll show you several pieces from the series. But first, in all of this work, I've used the actual cartography of the Middle East, beginning with my own history as one of the Palestinian diaspora, to talk about how the redefinition of borders by colonialists over 70 years ago has continued to create disruption in that region of the world. I've used the methods of fracturing, mirroring, and reconfiguring, and the traditions of indigenous design that I grew up with, including mother-of-pearl abalone handiwork, to celebrate the cultural history of this region while at the same time subversively critiquing it. These reverse paintings on plexiglass are backed with crumpled aluminum foil. To make this work, I traced the maps of Israel and Palestine and the region, mirrored them, and then traced the shapes that resulted from their mirroring. In this piece, you can see two views of the same work that look different because of how they are lit. I translated the paintings from the series into a pulp drawing for the exhibition Full Circle at the Southwest School of Art that was organized by our dear friend Beck Whited, who, with Lynn Sures, organized us into Pulparazzi. I pinned the pulp drawings onto a mirrored surface with map pins to suggest the potential for movement and reconfiguration. I went on to make a series of mother of pearl pieces using the same design, mounting them on burnt wood instead of colored foil. So research has been an important part of my practice, and I wanted to delve deeper into some ways of speaking about land and organic life, and the isolation of COVID provided a perfect opportunity for me to do that. Doing this research, I found parallels between habitat fragmentation, the effects of geographic fragmentation on biologic diversity, flagella, the means of movement for microscopic organisms, plant metamorphosis, root structures, the concept of being uprooted, and cell division, thinking about the division of Palestine to create Israel and the subsequent clusters of settlements. So in my piece, Milk and Honey Stuck, I began by embedding mother of pearl acrylic cut into the shapes again of Israel, Palestine, the West Bank, Gaza, Jerusalem, and the settlements, as well as the resulting shapes occurring from the cartography's mirroring, and placed them into wet sheets of overbeaten abaca, which I pigmented various colors of honey. Once the sheets dried, I painted on them with values of white gouache. The embedded land masses transformed into biological specimens, creating a tension between stasis and potentiality, the search for the promised land, the land of milk and honey, and suggesting a re-examination of land as a malleable, movable, biologic, and political construct. So thank you, and now I would like to introduce my friend, Peter Sowiski.
Hello, and thank you, Michelle. As you can see, I'm a pulp painter. I've been working in pulp painting for a long time. Here back in the 80s, I was working on a series called War Boards, which were shield-like shaped pieces done improvisationally. This is sort of the root of me working with military imagery. And it has involved both an infatuation with and admiration of, as well as a repulsion about what military hardware can do to people. This got me focusing on primarily military imagery and service figures around the time of the Gulf War. You can see here a series of interrelated mosaic panels as part of the hand paper making portfolio back in 2003 with printed, repeated imagery of the B-52. By 2005, I had been embarking on full-scale or actual size renderings of aircraft and the service figures. I work on poured or floated sheets, usually with an abaca and kozo base layer, over which I either mix in pigmented cotton or abaca pulps, or overlaid with basted washes of colored pulps. By the time we get to the period of change that we're referring to, you can see here that I continued this approach. This one is entitled Duck, Chinook, which shows a serviceman and a Chinook helicopter. You can see that it's very textured and also see that the basted overlays are built up. This one is one of an ascending service figure entitled Mad from 2016. This is another full-scale or actual size rendering, and this time of a Predator drone with accompanying service figure. In this studio shot, you can see how I work on a number of panels tangentially at once, and the basting and ear syringe approach that I use with the colored pulps. The upper left-hand panel of that Predator piece shows an indexed printed area to serve as a locator for where the piece is in the mosaic. A real turning point came in 2017 with this piece called Ordnance, which is of some shells, but it looked like a cathedral. So I began to exploit not only the portraits of the aircraft, but also the idea of the weaponization of politics and military and religion. So this series is called Weapon Worship, and it shows the aircraft pitted against or with the religious architecture, both done in silhouettes. You can see here as it's been pulp painted, the result. I'm aiming to have these show not only the beautiful qualities of paper, but also the strong content of the pieces and what they mean to me personally and what they may mean to others aesthetically, politically, and socially. And the detail here of the Gothic side of that piece, the B-52 piece, after which, looking at the textures and color overlays, I would like to introduce Joan Hall, a friend of mine for a long time. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter and Lynn. I live on an island in the state of Rhode Island, connected by bridges, so I'm used to a certain degree of isolation when the seasonal residents leave. I did not realize how much social isolation from friends and neighbors and restricted travel would affect me mentally during the pandemic. It was a journey into the unknown. Since the early 90s, my work has been informed by an interest in environmental issues in relationship to our mortality. As points of departure, I use scientific data and other sources of information on climate change that are related specifically to the ocean and a global concern about plastic pollution. The panels are printed on Kozo and Gampi sheets, laminated to Mylar, and attached with handmade glass pins or Velcro. I usually work with assistants. I am printing a collagraph pre-pandemic lockdown with Anna Benjamin on a panel for algae bloom. Times Are A-Changing was a transitional piece meant for a show that never happened. Through the use of color, it represents the change from a healthy sea to a dying one, a healthy planet to a world in rapid decline on multiple levels. Overlapping panels create secondary colors while I build the constructions. My plates are made on a white plastic called Comatex. I emboss them with plastic and other found marine detritus, then develop them further with tones and washes. Then everything changed. The pandemic brought on a wave of new residents. The news was difficult to watch. Leaving home felt dangerous, and it all buzzed inside my head, making me restless and unable to focus in the studio. The new normal was in effect. Long walks on the beach with my dog made me aware of a new detritus caused by the pandemic: masks and gloves. This became the motivation and inspiration for new work. Not only was I embossing plates with plastic, but I began to develop the plates further by the addition of mask and glove imagery. I use acrylic and various materials to create lights and darks, documenting the times in my studio. Stephanie Tyson and Michaela Colagnesi made paper so I would have a stockpile to use as we anticipated a lockdown. They printed and made paper and masks. It became the new norm, until that changed when one assistant tested positive for COVID. I closed the studio, anyone and everyone. I had to rethink how to do everything where I thought I needed assistance. Clamps on my decal box were my new assistants. I began to experiment with different pulps and ways to apply color. I slowed down and played more. I was having some fun and was trying new things that I'd been thinking about doing for a long time. My new studio assistant was Captain, my dog. The Pandemic Reef series works were made with no printing or cutting, sometimes new, something new, and on a much smaller scale than I usually work. Masks and gloves were an obsession outside the studio and in the morning light, back to sculptural constructions, new materials, both conceptual and technical, added to my interest in complexity and piling things up. Touches Me, Touches You was a journey into a new color exploration and construction. There is usually no pre-planning for the pieces, only a specific idea that takes form as the panels are layered and the pieces come to life. I cut a series of small masks to combine and create a large sheet that could wave and fold across the top of the other panels, rather than always using larger sheets. Repetition in a time of trauma. I Will Follow You was a return to glass beads and a flatter construction. Masks and glove detritus seemed to follow me everywhere. Further exploration into mixed materials and processes were used along with more complex layering in this piece. While restrictions eased after vaccinations, I was in an exhibition in June and was around more people in a few hours than I had been in over a year. It was both strange and exhilarating and a little frightening. Looking back, the anxiety about staying safe was offset by my studio, which was my sanctuary. There, the ugly news was forgotten when I was lost in work, and I also had time to create a new website, which was long overdue. Now I would like to introduce artist and longtime friend, John Babcock.
Thank you, Joan. A few years ago, I did an installation called Poet's Corner, consisting of poems and proverbs cut into paper with my plotter cutter. Last year, I decided to add to it with 10 additional works, specifically adding more foreign language pieces. I selected poems, lyrics, proverbs by Pablo Neruda, Rumi, Neil Simon, Pink Floyd, to name a few. The project consists of 4 parts. Obviously the poetry, then selecting the fonts and manipulating the words in a graphics program on the computer, then making the paper. For the most part, each sheet of paper I made was for a specific poem. The words are then cut with the plotter and sometimes by hand. The special paper I make for the plotter cutter is a mix of Hollander beaten abaca and abaca stirred in one of my mixers. This pulp, it has a smaller shrink rate. The knife that cuts the paper requires a moderately hard surface. Showing here in the studio are some of the newer works. Here I'm pouring the pulp on a screen in a water bath. I transfer the screen to another surface and detail the edges. The gray pulp was for the lyrics of the Pink Floyd song, "The Sun is Eclipsed by the Moon." Before these pieces were dry, I sprayed pigmented pulp on some to create a gradation of color, and of course this changes the color on one side. The fiber is tough and not always cut all the way through. This is my newest wireless plotter that does the cutting. In March of 2020, I read in the news this Chinese proverb: "Those who carry firewood for the masses are those who freeze to death in the wind and the snow." This was being passed around on social media in China, a tribute to Dr. Li Wenliang in Wuhan. He sent a message on December 30th to a group of fellow doctors warning them about a possible outbreak of an illness that resembled SARS. He was arrested. I made this multicolored red paper 14 feet long and cut the Chinese characters into the paper as my tribute to Li Wenliang. I work alone, but certainly not in a vacuum. the world is going through some hard times, it is a time for change. I, for one, have enjoyed making these objects out of poetry. The process and the result are therapeutic, not just for me, but for my audience as well. I like art that makes you feel good, but sometimes the object is to make people think. Pablo Neruda. My UPS driver gave me this poem. My original intention was to cut an excerpt of the poem in a 10-foot strip, but the entire poem moved me. Its relevance at the time, with world events as they are, compelled me to cut the entire poem and make it into an object I could feel and see. I cut this in several versions, both in English and Spanish. Let me read you a few verses. Keeping quiet. Now we will all count to 12, and we will all keep still. This one time upon the earth, let's not speak any language. Let's stop for 1 second and not move our arms so much. It would be a delicious moment without hurry, without locomotives. All of us would be together in a sudden uneasiness. The fisherman in the cold sea would do no harm to the whales, and the peasant gathering salt would look at his torn hands. And the last verse, now I will count to 12, and you keep quiet, and I will go. Thank you. And now I would like to introduce my good friend, Lynn Sures.
Thank you, John. Hello, everyone. I'll talk about ancestors distant from us in time and space. In 2019, I finished drawing the Hellhole Gorge, begun in Kenya and completed in my studio. The raw desert basin is strafed with gorges like the one that begins in this drawing, where evidence of early human habitation is found. I made kanaf paper to evoke the current landscape. In 2019, I was also drawing fossils. I'm a research associate at the National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C., as a component of my studio practice. The fossil you see was found nearly complete, a full skeleton, and buried by her feet was a child. They lived about 95,000 years ago. A kind of mineral printed likeness of a living thing in a specific moment, a fossil, preserves the entity through time and space. Neanderthals and archaic Homo sapiens were artists, the first to use reddish ochre pigment for decorative purposes. I made sisal paper, pigmented like that mineral, to portray them. I imagine their creative thought. When the museum closed in early 2020, I had no access to fossils. The pandemic and the political situation in my country made me too distressed to draw anyway. I made paper from raw hemp. The sheets are translucent, some pigmented silver to transition between the large steel book covers I had forged and the natural hemp. Fibrous decal edges suggest a dynamic presence rather than refinement and order. On my pulp paintings, I printed lino cuts to pair with the steel covers. During the months of work on the books, I found solace in every step of the process, repeated many times with a necessary sense of calm, living a part of each day inside this project, far from disease and injustice. The sculptural book series, Time is Not Linear, is about physical forces in nature. Everything is in motion in these sculpted books, twists and turns of steel, patterns of prints, fluidity of the pages as they settle into positions. People have always desired to see the world and beyond as being connected to us. Physics shows us that time is not independent from space. The observer opens the books, the pages wave as directed by ambient forces, each time in different waves. This series touches my curiosity about space-time, in its fantastic presence, a trait of nature showing and telling us about our world and all things physical. La Mano dell'Uomo is a fine press collaboration with my colleague Tom Leach. Conceived in 2017, we began in 2019 making the paper for the edition during a special residency at the Museum of Paper and Watermark in Fabriano, Italy. We were revisiting and republishing a simple small book written and illustrated by a socially and politically active Italian artist, Bruno Caruso. Meeting to finish the book together was delayed for more than a year by the pandemic. Finally, in June and July of 2021, we met to print at the Palace of the Governors, Santa Fe, New Mexico, publisher of the edition. I had translated Caruso's Italian text into English, which we letterpress printed in handset monotype, also using letterpress on polymer plates on his illustrations. The large format handmade paper, hand-bound book, and handmade cases are an homage to the original small libretto made 50 years ago by Bruno Caruso as a New Year's greeting. La Mano dell'Uomo is a tribute to the human hand, capable of beautiful artistry, craft, and ingenious invention, but also of destructive actions in concert with the human mind. These final images whisper about what else I've worked on in 2021. Reaching back to my fascination with our earliest ancestors, unable to be at the museum as the pandemic and the social ills of my country continue, I've researched, drawn, and carved these plates of ancient fossil human footprints. Papermaking for the project began in late summer 2021. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Next, we'll have a short conversation together, and let's see where it goes. First, I want to ask Joan, you had made some comments about sanctuary that might be an interesting opener for our conversation.
Well, I think as artists, all of us saw our studio as a sanctuary, because that's where we went to sort of remove ourselves from what was going on in the world. But it's something I think we always do naturally. So we just kind of stayed in the studio more.
That's right. I think for all of us, plus many other artists, that was a big plus during this time, was that we had that, where most people would stream movies or something. We had the additional benefit of having our own sanctuaries, our studios.
And I felt too that, my mind was kind of a sanctuary in a way. There were the walls of the studio within which I worked, but then there was my mind. And so it was a sort of a way of sort of withdrawing from the rest of the world. And it made my work, I think, a little bit more intensive, and the work process more intensive too.
Like, the studio is always a sanctuary. It's always a place where you just feel really right when you're in the studio anyway. But we certainly had things we had to block out in order to stay, to be comfortable in our lives, in our own heads at least. And, the events of the world, the political, social, and certainly, the pandemic made it really important to be able to relieve your mind. And that studio sanctuary did that.
Well, the other thing that I found is that I have not gone to certain conferences, or I've not gone to go to a talk, because I would calculate how much time it was taking me out of my studio, and I would go, I don't want to take that time right now. And there was something great about being able to just flip on my computer and have it in my studio and listen to something while I could keep working. I found that part of what happened during the pandemic was somewhat of an advantage. in terms of my being able to work and not having to feel like I had to split my time and choose.
Mm.
Yeah. Well, John, you had mentioned something that seems like it might take place when one is in a sanctuary setting, and that is the concept of repetition that you saw through your own work and maybe others of
Well,
us.
when I was, during watching everybody's presentation, I was kind of looking for, questions and certainly I found that I didn't have as many questions as I had observations about people's, about our work. I mean, we know each other, so it wasn't so much of a question, but the repetitive motion, I noticed in the presentation that you, for instance, Lynn, sewing those signatures in the book over and over again, sewing signatures, and time is not linear. And then I was looking at Michelle's work in the Land of Milk and Honey Stuck, that that the way those root structures seemed like intricately painted in making those landforms, those mirrored landforms, into other real interesting entities of sorts. And then Joan, when she's working on that decal box and then starts cutting all those mylar masks and shapes over and over again, all of these different things. And for myself, when I cut these long strips of paper and cut these poems in the paper, that cutter doesn't cut. That cutter does not cut all my fibers very well. And so, because there's some tough fiber in there, and that little knife, carbide knife, will skip over. And so I'm late at night working, cutting out all the letters and straightening things up. The Chinese piece had to have all these little bridges to hold the centers in. And so I was putting linen thread on the back side to hold all the characters in place, that kind of thing. So, it was over and over again, and kind of a cathartic thing one does in the studio, and seemed quite appropriate during this COVID time.
Yeah.
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 Oh, go ahead.
I felt that it was cathartic to work repetitively. And there was a sense of security that I felt, that I could make all of those individual sheets of paper and embed my landforms in them. I knew what I was going to do in the studio every day. I didn't know what was going to go on in the rest of the world. But I knew that I had a structure and that gave me a sense of security and well-being when I worked. And also I could sort of see a future too. It was sort of step by step by step. And that's just the opposite of what I felt was going on in the rest of the world outside of the sanctuary of the studio.
Well, and also it's been documented that repetition in a time of trauma is a type of healing. There have been books written about it. And I started doing repetition many years ago because of a personal change in my life. And I find interesting what John said was late at night. I like to be up at night, but sometimes I don't want to be doing the things where I have to really be thinking about how I'm putting a mark down. But if I've got this repetition that I'm doing because I want to create something bigger, it's the thing I love to do at night in the studio.
I felt that the repetition was actually the only way that I could face each day, that I was unable to risk doing anything that was like blatantly creative because of the thoughts that I didn't want to come to the forefront of my mind. And I knew that if I just sat there and pasted paper and sewed and sewed and sewed, that I could maintain that equilibrium.
Yeah.
You know, Peter mentioned something that I thought was so interesting about our work is, you know, our connection to humanity, to the human race. And Peter, what were you thinking about?
Well, I guess it was prompted by, observing each of our individual presentations. It occurred to me that with the drastic variety that the physical form of all of our different works take, and certainly, even though we're working in the same field, we have real varied approaches to the materials and the craft, of paper making, etc. But what occurred to me was that even with those different and varied approaches and outcomes, the subtext for it, for me, was that these are all representations of our humanity and our observations and our concerns for, our fellow humans. And I found that to be really comforting in a way, because it wasn't a way that I was used to using to interpret, visual aesthetics and the content of artists' works. So I guess it's tied into a little bit of us, knowing each other for, certain, in some cases, very lengthy periods of time. But having not really occurred to go down that road of thinking about something as very general as that tie that all of our works have. I found it delightful.
I also found a tie that we all use beauty to send a message, because we love paper. We love how it looks. I mean, there's lots of other ways you can make art, but there's something about the beauty of paper that we've all explored in different ways to create our message.
Yeah, and that was one of the thoughts that I had too, in looking at Peter's work and your work, Peter, in particular. Just, you're working with the symbolic imagery, juxtaposing weaponry, weapons of war, and the architecture of the church, and the spirit and religion and so on, and in particular with the formality of the architecture of the church, and then the design of the weapon. One would think, and you're working with silhouettes, so one would think that it would be really cold, hard edged. And even though the images are very simple and silhouetted, they're beautiful and soft, and they vibrate. And I think you're working with paper in such a way, and the paper allows you to create these images that are just sort of float in between being really horrific and frightening and hard and heavy and soft and poetic. And I really respond to that. Yeah.
Well, certainly I do too, of course, but
yeah. Yeah.
I'd like to maybe end up by asking Michelle to maybe expand a little bit on a question that you had asked before about what does the future hold for our work? You had some interesting thoughts about that.
Yeah, well, I was just, in looking at everyone's work and seeing, the impression that I had was that we're all the work that we did during COVID seems to be a development of the work that we have been doing, but it has shifted slightly. I know in my case, the Milk and Honey Stuck, I've continued to work with these issues of Palestine and Israel and the idea of borders and boundaries and the politics of that and so on. And now I have moved to a more rural environment, and I'm still thinking about that, thinking about roots and branches, and I'm now carving sticks, and I want to embed them in paper, and the piece that I did during COVID is actually a stepping stone to this next body of work that I have started. But I'm very anxious to get back into making more paper, as I don't have a studio at the moment. But I'm just curious as to how other people are feeling about their work, and whether what they see that the future is of the work, and whether it has changed because of the experience of COVID and the way that we've been working during the pandemic.
For me, it's super clear what the future holds because I'm in the future. As you mentioned, you're immersed already in your next project, and I gave a tiny taste of what I'm working on too, with those 2 of the 25 panels that I've cut to make my next project out of. But it's interesting because it's even more unknown to me exactly where it's going to go than usual. Being unknown is very normal for me. I kind of find my way through the work that I do. But this series is, it's starting to formulate in my head, and it's all about movement, human movement. And I just today read an article that I hadn't seen before about new and earlier migrations that have been hypothesized from Africa earlier than has been previously substantiated. And it just like electrified my head. I'm just, visualizing people moving, reaching, changing, and growing. Very excited to continue.
That's about humanity, isn't it?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
As with the past, so will be the future.
I guess so. Yeah.
Movement.
Well, and the masks are fading away in some ways for me because there were so many that I saw on the beaches that it just sort of naturally became a part of my interest in the ocean and climate change. But I'm getting ready to document some things with an underwater drone. And I'm sort of excited to start. I've had the drone, but I finally found an operator so I don't lose it at 100 feet. But something that just keeps coming to mind, I wrote it down, but John, you made that comment in the poem about now I will count to 12 and you keep quiet and I will go. And it keeps going round and round in my head. Well, that's COVID. I hope COVID's saying that to us. Yeah. And that's something that I can't get that, John, that's going to stick with me. And that's going to be sort of like my weirdness, because someone once told me I had a very dark relationship to the ocean, which cracks me up, of course, because I sail. I'm on the water and I live on an island. So it's a part of my life, but that is now a part of my life.
So everyone, well, talking about the future, I think was great, and it's going to be the way that our brief conversation closes, and we'll hear questions next from anyone in the IAPMA audience that may have something they want to ask us. And thank you all so much for your participation so far, and we invite your questions.